EFF and SAFTU have criticised the government of using scare tactics to infringe on the rights of citizens to protest. Now, to help us understand the laws of protesting in this country, I'm joined by Stanley Malematja, who's a protest law analyst. Stanley, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us. I really want to hit the ground running with this conversation because, you know, we are hearing sort of different understandings of what it means to protest in South Africa, which, as we know, is a constitutionally protected right, but yet the rhetoric seems to be causing some confusion as to whether or not this can be deemed a protest and as such protected like a protest ought to be.
Good morning and thank you for having me. Definitely this can be categorized as a protest. I mean, our starting point where we should look is under Section 17 of the Constitution. And I think it's important to mention that, you know, language and terminology are very important in terms of how we perceive or understand things. And one would appreciate that the word shutdown is not included under Section 17. Of the Constitution, but that does not necessarily mean that shutdowns are outlawed. But the difference here is that when we talk about shutdowns, we know that it is the standstill of the proper functioning of society or the proper functioning of things, if we can put it that way. Then arguably, if one looks at it in that way, it will mean that inevitably a shutdown will disturb public peace because people cannot move as freely as they want. But that should not be confused to say that a shutdown is unlawful, because we need to go again and look at the Regulations of Gatherings Act, which is the primary legislation which regulates Section 17 of the Constitution. And there it tells us that, an unlawful protest is one that has been prohibited in terms of the provisions of Section 5 of that piece of legislation. So one can, conclude that until Section 5 has been invoked, then a protest or a shutdown, remains within the confines of the law.
So logic dictates, because we know that the DA is heading to court just this morning, in fact, to argue for a court interdict to prohibit this planned march. If such an interdict is approved, that would fall under the ambit of a Section 5, as you've just alluded to.
Yeah, but you know what? In all honesty, that would be absurd if such an interdict is granted, because why would one want to interdict someone or a group of people from exercising a constitutionally guaranteed human right? And also the concerns raised by the DA are actually covered under the provisions of Section 11 of the Regulations of Gatherings Act, that talks about joint and several liability of any damage that occurs during a protest, and it specifically speaks to who gets to be held accountable. And our courts have also, spoken on the interpretation of the provisions of Section 11 of the Regulations of the Gatherings Act. That particular provision actually was under attack on the basis of constitutionality. And I think it was one of the trade unions that argued that to hold participants or the convener of a protest jointly and severally liable for damages that occur after a protest it's rather tantamount to infringing their right to protest and intimidating them from protest, because any other person can just come and damage property or infringe on other people's rights, and that blame can be placed on the convener of the protest. And the Constitutional Court said, hold on, that is not the case. Actually, this section is there to ensure that third parties are protected against any damage that might occur against protests. So I really don't know why the DA is running to the courts, because the Regulations of Gatherings Act already addresses their concerns. But this is a democratic country. Everyone has a right to access to courts. So I guess they can run in at any time they wish to do so.
Indeed. It seems what we're really dealing with here, Stanley, is a set of competing interests, really. But I want to come back to the earlier point that you made around language and the toll that it has when it comes to us, responding appropriately to what's happening on Monday. I want to play a quick bite for you. Just bear with me and listen to what ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula had to say about the EFF's planned march. Let's take a listen.
Political science have taught us that insurrection, it is something that is about interrupting economic activity within the state, but you can't promote insurrection and call for the stall of economic activity in a democratic dispensation. Now, here in South Africa, you've got a right to protest, but to shut down, it goes beyond protest. And your right as a political party, as an individual, you are basically challenging the authority of the state. You are basically challenging the rule of law in the country. We don't venture into political parties and what they want and what they don't want.
All right, so Stanley, it seems we've got competing interests. We also seem to have a challenge of semantics coming up because, you know, Fikile Mbalula used several words. He used insurrection, for instance. He used, you know, the right to protest. He also used in the same breath, you know, the term shutdown. And I think herein lies the problem, where when EFF leaders are promoting their campaign, the rhetoric being used is, you know, nothing will be operational. Key infrastructure units will be non-operational, right? Which speaks to the shutdown element of what they're trying to do on Monday. Is there a synergy between what they're saying to the South African people and what Section 17 enshrines in the Constitution?
That's a great question. Perhaps let's look at what our courts have said previously. Let me just refer you to the case of Fourways Mall versus South African Commercial Catering and Allied Union Workers, right? Now, the court found that the provisions of Section 17 of the Constitution do not protect actions in which protesters intimidate the general public and interfere with the rights of other tenants of a shopping mall. So already our courts have already, pronounced as to what type of actions are protected under Section 17 of the Constitution. Now, immediately when an action is one that intimidates other people, or it, makes it difficult or impossible for other people to exercise their rights, then that conduct is not protected in the Constitution. There is also the case of Ndlela and others versus the state. Now, there, what the courts found, in fact, the High Court found that even if a protest is peaceful, the moment there is an engagement in conduct by protesters in which that conduct infringes or interferes with other people's rights, that peaceful protest on its own can be able to sustain the charges of the common law offense of public violence. Now, it is very clear what is protected under Section 17 of the Constitution and what is not protected. So the moment other people's rights are infringed, then that becomes a problem, and our courts have pronounced on that. But now the difficulty here that we are facing is actually that protests by their own nature, they are disruptive because the whole narrative behind protest actions is that it's not business as usual. Therefore, it is inevitable that certain rights of other citizens will be infringed. Now, it's all about how do now the state react towards that. And I'm saying this because it is important that we have seen now how the military has been roped in, how SAPS has been roped in, and we need to be careful with that type of, approach from the state, because, South Africa has been found to be one of those countries which, are heavy-handed when it comes to responding to issues of crowd control. They are found to be one of those countries that are unable to follow international protocols and international laws in terms of using less lethal weapons to disperse the crowd. Now, it is very important that we mention this because we don't want to see another Marikana in the eve of Human Rights Day. So we really need to be careful about how the state is responding to this. We really need to be careful about the language and terminology that is being used by the ruling party, because that actually galvanizes something which is which can be regrettable, if I can put it that way. So it is very important also that, those who are protesting should always make sure that, they try to stay within the confines of the law. Some of the easiest ways to stay within the confines of the law, the regulations of the Gatherings Act does stipulate that for every 10 protesters or for every 10 participants of a protest, there needs to be one marshal. And those marshals, they need to be distinguishable from the participants of the protest. So the conveners of the protest themselves, they have a huge responsibility to ensure that they stay within the confines of the of Section 17 of the Constitution. Nevertheless, we need to go back and revisit the preamble of the Regulations of Gatherings Act, which says that where a person engages in their right to protest or exercises their right to protest, they should enjoy the protection of the state. So here what the RTA tells us, in fact, is that it is actually the participants of the protest that need more protection so as to ensure that they remain within the confines of the law. And also it speaks about the powers and conduct of the police. What are those powers? Police, if there is disruption, they need not respond to it harshly. The Regulations of Gatherings Act does say to the police that they need to at least announce in 2 official languages. I think most obviously one would be English and the other one would depend on the demographic of the participants of the protest, at least announcing those 2 languages and tell them to disperse and give them the reasonable time to disperse. So I think there really needs to be a balance, and people or stakeholders in this shutdown need to understand their roles so that we can respect and promote what is drafted in the Bill of Rights.
Right. Well, Stanley, thank you so much for your time. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, especially as we zone in on the state's reaction and watch closely how on the day itself it responds to that planned shutdown. Thank you very much for your time.